Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Stephen Kenny. I'm the founder and principal of a strategy consultancy called Foresight Vector, and also the director of MEI's Strategic Foresight Initiative. I want to welcome you all to today's webinar on COVID-19 and the futures of conflict in the Middle East. Our discussion today will focus on how we anticipate the pandemic that's ongoing could potentially affect the dynamics of conflict in the Middle East region. Back in the spring, early in this crisis, I teamed up with Ross Harrison, who's with us today, to co-author a paper in which we posited a set of scenarios that focus on that question. It's one of the first publications of MEI's Strategic Foresight Initiative, and you can find it on MEI's website. The work that we do in the Strategic Foresight Initiative is to explore alternate futures for the region and the different paths that could lead the region in different future directions. One of the fundamental premises of the work we do in the Foresight Initiative is that a range of futures is possible and that we can prepare for them by examining the different forces of change going on in the world around us today and in the future, how they might play out and how they might interact with one another. The COVID-19 pandemic for the Middle East and for the rest of the world certainly is among the most consequential forces of change that we will experience in the next couple of years, and perhaps for much longer than that. In the scenarios that Ross and I developed, we looked at three dimensions of the pandemic as a force of change, potentially influencing conflict in the region. The first is the public health response to the virus and the degree to which the actions of governments and sub-state actors and international institutions might, on the one hand, be complementary and additive to one another, or alternatively might be disjointed or even work at cross purposes. The second is the effects of the pandemic on the economies of the region and the degree to which short-term necessary palliative responses could, on the one hand, foster or potentially, on the other hand, put at risk a more enduring economic recovery and resilience. The third dimension we looked at was the social and social-political dynamics and how they might come into contact with the pandemic, how pre-existing sources of unrest might be inflamed or potentially muted by the pandemic, and the degree to which unrest might emerge about the pandemic itself and the government's responses to it. We have three terrific panelists here with us today who will talk with us not about these scenarios, but about what they're observing in their work in the region and their analysis of the region. What signals are they seeing of the foreign policy and conflict behaviors of key actors in the region being affected by the pandemic, and what are they seeing with respect to the social dynamics and how those are being affected and how that might in turn be affecting the dynamics of conflict. I'm pleased to introduce first Alexandra Clare. Alexandra is the CEO and co-founder of Recoded, which provides free coding boot camps and other digital skill training for conflict-affected youth in Turkey, Yemen, and Iraq, and I believe more recently they've begun in Lebanon as well. Second, we have Nancy Ezzedine. Nancy is a research fellow at the Clingendael Institute, which is a think tank and leading diplomatic academy in the Netherlands. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Ross Harrison is with us. Ross is on the political science faculty at the University of Pittsburgh, and he is also the director of research and a senior fellow here at MEI. Alexandra, Nancy, Ross, thank you all very much for joining us today for this discussion. I know we're all looking forward to it. For all of you in the audience, to submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching on our YouTube live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. And if you have any technical issues, please email them also to events@mei.edu. Feel free to ask a question at any point during the webinar. I'll be looking at the Q&A stream and I'll try to factor as many of them as possible into our discussion. So with that, let's jump in. I'd like to start with how things are playing out with respect to our question over the last 6 months since the spring and the pandemic really started to take hold. Let me start with you, Nancy. You and your colleagues at Clingendael Institute back in April wrote a paper that did some analysis and made some projections about how the pandemic might affect conflict in the region. What are you seeing in the 6 months since then in your ongoing monitoring and in your recent visit to the region?
Thank you first for having me. It's great to be here. I think it's a good moment to reflect on some of the findings of the initial research that we conducted at Klingenau, but also other think tanks and research centers around the world tried to forecast some of the impacts of the pandemic on specifically conflict dynamics in the region. And to start off, I'm going to focus a bit of my intervention on the Levant, specifically because what we see is that the impact of COVID has varied significantly across countries in the region. And if we specifically look at countries or states with weak capacities and limited resources, such as countries like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, even Palestine, what they've done, these countries have largely let the virus run its course because they are not able to intervene effectively in terms of administrative skills, healthcare capabilities, but also public confidence to a certain extent. And what this caused is that it's created a gap in the response that has been capitalized by some of the sub-state actors and political groups. And this is specifically evidenced in sort of the easing of restrictions that we see in like Lebanon, Iraq, but also a number of other countries, despite the alarming increases in cases on a daily basis. So what I think I could take from our initial analysis that we still see today in these countries as a result is that COVID has provided political elites and sub-state actors with an opportunity to reassert their roles and strengthen the loyalty reward system to their constituents. This is particularly significant as it produces an opportunity for some of these groups, these elite groups, to re-legitimize themselves, specifically in relation to the very citizens that were protesting against them only weeks before COVID hit. And as such, these citizens or these constituents have become dependent on their services once again. And what we see is that in times of need or in times of crises, it becomes really difficult to protest as it comes with the risk of being cut off from essential sub-state sources of support and recovery. So I could provide brief examples now, but maybe we could touch upon them again later on in discussion. But for example, if we take Lebanon and Iraq, we have the cases of sub-state actors like Hezbollah or the Popular Mobilization Forces, PMF, which have both been at the forefront of providing medical assistance in response to the pandemic. And in addition to making some of their field hospitals accessible to the public, they've also, for example, the PMF has joined forces with some of the shrine authorities to build civil hospitals. Hezbollah has deployed approximately more than 200,000 of its medics across hospitals it owns, but also a number of disused hospitals that it rehabilitated. So what we really see is that these sub-state actors and these groups have been trying to use COVID as an opportunity to support their rebranding campaign that showcases their rapid switch from the provision of security to the provision of relief efforts. Accordingly, what does this mean really for conflict dynamics is that the mobilization of such sectarian structures, especially in countries that are composed of multi-ethnic, multi-sectarian groups and are really susceptible to civil strife and civil fragmentation, COVID has provided the space or an opportunities for these political and sub-state groups to increase their popular support and potentially strengthen their re-entrenchment or re-control of some of the political processes in response to the pandemic.
Thank you, Nancy. Ali, let me ask you a similar question. I know Recoded's training has all moved online, but you have people on the ground in Iraq and Yemen, Turkey, and Lebanon. What are you and what are they seeing and observing with respect to the social and economic impacts of the pandemic and how that may be influencing unrest and sources of conflict?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, and it's really wonderful to be here with you all. So I think in terms of the economic fallout, it's definitely going to disproportionately impact some countries more than others, sort of over the long term. And I think what we'll see is that countries that already had sort of low capacity, high populations, and really low trust in governmental institutions will probably be more impacted, sort of in the long term, as well as what Nancy was saying, countries that are already sort of been severely impacted by ongoing conflicts. So countries like Libya, Iraq, Syria, where their economies and healthcare systems were already largely devastated before the pandemic. And I think what we're seeing is, because of the sort of shorter term economic implications as a result of COVID, you have higher rates of unemployment in a region where, you already had a massive youth bulge and high rates of unemployment. So if you take a country like Iraq, which has one of the highest youth populations in the world, with 65% of the population under the age of 30, and unemployment rates already at sort of around 30%, that has increased since COVID to some saying that the rate is almost 78%, especially for youth, that, refugees, people that are already affected by conflict, and women are also disproportionately being economically impacted by the pandemic. And it's unclear how long that trend is going to go on, and how quickly we're going to be able to sort of recover. And I think the flow-on impacts of sort of that economic crisis are going to be exacerbated because a lot of these countries don't have strong social safety nets. And we've seen a huge drop in sort of remittances. So you're seeing increased rates of food insecurity, especially for countries which import a lot of their food. So Iraq is a country that doesn't produce a lot of food, they import everything. You're seeing a huge education crisis as parents are more unlikely to sort of send their children physically to school. And there is a very real digital inequality divide where parents are unable to sort of access online education, even if it was available. And so I think what we're really seeing as well is sort of a huge increase in poverty indicators. So we're seeing that just in the span of the last couple of months, nearly 14 million additional people will fall below the poverty line across the Middle East as a result of sort of the economic impacts of COVID. I think we're also seeing larger rates of gender-based violence on women and children, which is pretty concerning. And I think, you will probably see an increased rate of child work because of the economic pressures from families really trying to sort of mitigate the economic impacts of this. And as Nancy said, we're also seeing in Iraq a huge rise in non-state actors. So since COVID, ISIS has sort of taken a step forward, I think, because of a number of reasons. First, you're seeing a withdrawal in US engagement, which is sort of empowering them to engage a little bit more and fill some of the gaps and take advantage of the fact that the government is largely distracted. And, a lot of governments across the region are unable to provide services, and you're seeing a large number of non-state actors trying to fill those service gaps, especially in rural areas where they may be more mobile, just by, proximity, for example.
Interesting. Sounds like a lot of similarities to what Nancy was talking about, and just a worsening of some of the impacts that have been ongoing there for a long time. Ross, let me turn to you. You've done a great deal of work on conflict in the Middle East, going well back before the pandemic. And some of the things that Ali has just talked about here, I know from working with you are, sources and roots of conflict going back for quite a long time. How do you envision the pandemic potentially having an enduring impact on these conflict dynamics that you've studied for years, either negatively, which is kind of the intuitive, or perhaps positively?
Thank you, Stephen. It's an honor to be here with you today. We've worked together for a couple of years now, and also with Nancy and Ali. It's also great to be with you. If you had asked me this question a year ago, prior to the pandemic, what would be the drivers and determinants of conflict in the Middle East as we approach 2025, I would have pointed to things like great power competition between the United States and Russia. I would have pointed to regional power competition primarily between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also including Israel and Turkey into the mix, UAE, Qatar, and so forth. I would also have pointed to facts on the ground, grievances on the ground, in terms of resolving the civil wars in Syria, Syria, Yemen, and Libya, and pointed to some of the grievances that have been driving protests in Lebanon and Iraq as determinants as to whether the region would move toward, as we approach 2025, into a more conflictual period, or perhaps where conflict would be mitigated. Asking me the same question today, in the middle of the pandemic, as to what conflict patterns might look like in 2025, I will point to those same factors. I don't think a lot has changed there. However, COVID-19 obviously is a wild card driver. What we do know is that it's going to shape outcomes in the ways that Nancy and Ali have pointed to, in terms of what's happening on the ground today and how that's likely to play out in the future. What we don't know is how the COVID-19 crisis and the economic aftershocks of that are going to interact with these other factors that I've identified that pre-existed the pandemic. You know, if you think about COVID, on the medical side, you know, physicians talk about the fact that COVID is most likely to have ugly effects with patients that have pre-existing conditions. And I think that same thing applies metaphorically to the region. And that is, the region has some pre-existing conditions that are going to make the effects that the pandemic has on conflict that much more profound. And the main, I think, underlying condition is a challenge of legitimacy, a crisis of legitimacy, which pre-existed the COVID-19 crisis, but is now playing out in the ways that Nancy and Ali have pointed to. And that legitimacy crisis relates to some of the grievances that I mentioned that drove countries like Syria, Yemen, and Libya to civil war, and have also animated the protests that we saw in Iraq and Lebanon before the crisis, before the COVID-19 crisis, and also after the crisis. So I think in terms of deepening the legitimacy crisis, what that means for conflict patterns going forward is it's going to make it that much more difficult for the countries that I mentioned, the countries that are in civil war, or the countries that are in crisis, but not in full-blown civil war, like Iraq and Lebanon, to make it that much more difficult for leadership, the leaders that are being beset by a legitimacy challenge, that much more difficult for them to climb out of this crisis. And I think some of the effects of the economic effects, which are really probably the most lasting effects of COVID-19, those effects are probably going to endure for a period of time and are going to be very unhelpful. You mentioned, Stephen, that it's likely we're going to be pessimistic in any kind of outlook related to the Middle East. I think that's true here. Unlikely to be helpful in terms of mitigating any kind of conflict going forward. The other factor, before I stop, I think that it's really important to look at is that conflict patterns in the region are not just taking place inside the civil war zones or inside Lebanon and Iraq, two countries that are fragile or failing states. They also are driven by regional dynamics, as I mentioned, between Iran and Saudi Arabia and other regional powers. And so those dynamics of how Saudi Arabia and Iran are competing inside the civil war zones are both a conflict contributor, and they also ultimately could be a conflict mitigant. I think the bad news here is that COVID-19 is likely to turn these countries, the regional powers and the international powers, meaning the United States and Russia, turn themselves inward. And when they turn themselves inward, it's unlikely that they're going to do some of the things that maybe we're going to talk about later in this session about what would be required to move the region into a more less of a conflict, move it beyond the conflict trap it has become, and into a more peaceful phase. So frankly, even though, Stephen, you and I wrote about some rosier scenarios in the paper that you referred to, I think 6 months later, I think we're looking at probably one of the less rosier scenarios. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross. Nancy and Ellie, let me ask you sort of the same question. And Nancy, in particular, what Ross was just talking about in terms of the crisis of legitimacy of the national level governments, relative to what you were talking about earlier, the sub-state actors kind of seeing and seizing an opportunity here to reassert or gain new legitimacy. What do each of you see as some of the longer term implications with respect to the pandemic's impact on conflict in light of what you're experiencing in your research, Nancy, and what you're experiencing in your work on the ground with Recoded? Ali, why don't we start with Nancy first, please?
Well, this is a difficult question, I think, because I agree with Ross that the pandemic produces sort of a crisis in legitimacy because it makes it highlights the deficiency in state capacities, but also in leadership. And we see that, I think, in both Iraq, Lebanon, but also in other countries like Syria, and also a number of Gulf countries that have more developed state capacities. And what I could say to that is it can go in both directions. Obviously, there's the saying, don't let a good crisis go to waste. And I think this like many of the other crises that came before COVID, there was big opportunity for change. I think what we see now in the discourse, let's say, for example, in Iraq, because there's a financial crisis, there's a leadership crisis, there's a COVID crisis, this has produced a lot of frustrations that have been accumulated and produced sort of pressure for change, at least. I would say I see that's more pressing in Iraq, for people wanting change. I think in Lebanon, it drove it in the other direction. I think in Lebanon, the accumulated crises have pushed people inwards into a state of survival of the fittest, where they resort to sort of sectarian representation and identification, and they resort to their sectarian leaders for protection and assistance, again, in times of vulnerability. So I think here it's more about the structures of political mobilization and the structures of these political identities, which differ from a country to the other, even though the people call Lebanon and Iraq sort of sister crises, but you see that the response has been very different, whereby in Lebanon, at least, we see that the crises, even with mass protests in October, we still see that the pandemic, but also the Beirut blast in August, pushed people inwards towards more fragmentation, more identification with sectarian political groupings, versus Iraq has pushed it towards more pressure, continued protests, not denying that there's a lot of vulnerability, and these citizens and groups require assistance from these political parties, but not from a sense of needing to identify with these groups. So I'll keep it at that, but I could reflect a bit further if you'd like.
Hey, Ali, interested in your perspective on this longer term implications question, and kind of from the legitimacy standpoint, curious, and this is to any of you, but let me ask Ali first. What are the prospects for other social sector, more positive forces to emerge with some legitimacy here as an alternative both to the national level governments and to the sub-state actors that have traditionally opposed those governments?
Yeah, I wish I could be positive about this. It's hard at this moment, because I think what we're also seeing across the region is COVID sort of also coincided with huge oil price fluctuations. So, and it's, unlike any other crisis in the sense it's impacted every country. So it's natural for everybody to sort of turn inwards as well to make sure that their own economies, their own people are sort of safe. So I think in terms of leadership, what we're actually going to see is potentially people being, leaders being left on their own. That's one potential outcome, which isn't always a great outcome, because you may have sort of people trying to consolidate leadership where it's not effective, and the rise in non-state actors. in terms of positive implications, I think you would need really sweeping reforms to be able to sort of have a positive outcome even in 2 years. And I don't know how likely that is, because it really requires huge governmental reform, huge outside investment, and it's unclear, how much engagement the US wants to maintain in the region. I think it will probably largely depend on the upcoming elections for what role the US plays in the Middle East going forward, and whether geopolitics will shift in that respect, and whether China will play a larger role going forward. And I also, it's unclear how international support or financing mechanisms are going to play a role in sort of reshaping reforms where it could have a really huge impact. So the reforms that I think are sort of needed and could play a huge impact across the region in terms of development are sort of large investments in education, technology, renewable energy, agriculture, which could lessen some of the sort of conflict dynamics, especially if youth across the region are really empowered rather than feeling further disenfranchised, which may, spiral into further and increasing protests and conflict dynamics.
Yeah, may I speak up, Stephen? On
Yeah,
this?
Ross, I was going to ask you, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I just want to amplify a little bit what Nancy mentioned, and certainly what Ali just mentioned. I think, there are attempts at leadership, at least in Iraq. There's a relatively new government, but there are structural problems that preceded the COVID-19 crisis in terms of the ability for even leaders that are well-intentioned to make the changes, get around, circumvent, or eliminate some of the corruption that we've seen in Iraq, to be able to have develop the kind of traction that you need to turn this COVID-19 crisis from a crisis to an opportunity. In Lebanon, you have something very different. I mean, there have been cries for the existing elite, both in terms of the Sunni Shia Christian leadership to stand down, for new leadership to emerge, but you have, number one, outside forces that are going to militate against that, Iran in the case of Hezbollah, and also the local elites there that are unwilling to yield power. So I don't see much positive in terms of real traction towards reform. You would think that this crisis would open up the space for that. The only thing that I see, and we're seeing a little bit of it through the research we're doing in MEI right now on some of these cross-cutting issues around gender and health and so forth, is there are heroes and heroines out there in terms of civil society, people that are really trying to push for change. And I have to say, at least in places like Iran and elsewhere, it's largely women driven, that are pushing, that are trying to do their very best to turn this moment into if not a moment of opportunity, at least a moment for survival. So I think if you get beyond the leadership level and you peel back the onion and you look further down in the society, there's some good news out there. It's just hard to imagine that good news and what we see in terms of good works on the ground can overwhelm some of the structural problems that we've all been talking about in terms of these societies that preceded the COVID-19 crisis, but are also now conspiring with the COVID-19 crisis to make things more difficult for the future.
I think that's right. And that's consistent with some other research that's also going on in the Strategic Foresight Initiative here, looking at some of those local level initiatives and how the crisis, in some cases, is proving an opportunity for them to strengthen their voice and network with one another. It'd be interesting to see how that potentially plays out. Ross, let me also ask you to return to your point about the international actors and regional actors turning inward and potentially not becoming involved in a way that they might in different conditions to try to mitigate or resolve conflict in the region. What could potentially in the next year or two, what would be some of the things that we would need to look for as indicators that might not be the case, that there might be some interest in doing that and some willingness to do it?
Yeah, well, Ali referred to the election, upcoming election, November. you definitely going to need a shift in posture on the part of the United States, frankly, on two different levels. One is in terms of producing some kind of traction or encouraging some kind of regional response to the pandemic and to the aftershocks of the pandemic that the region, but also the global community, are going to be experiencing. And so you're going to need some kind of international encouragement for the regional actors to cooperate across borders in significant ways. There have been some flurries of that. Early in the pandemic, you saw the UAE sending a medical mission to Iran, but not enough to really claim that this is some kind of an enduring pattern. So you're going to need the United States and other international actors to play a stronger role, something that the United States has not done. The United States has turned inward even prior to the COVID-19 crisis in terms of the Middle East. So you're going to need that. And I think you're also going to need a geopolitical rebalancing. Right now, what the United States has done is actually exacerbate many of the tensions that we see in the region by doubling down in support of our traditional allies, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and so forth, which is fine. Those are our enduring allies, but they're doubling down on them at the expense of any kind of possible dialogue with Iran. And we've gone backwards with respect to Iran. And whenever you push Iran into a corner, which is what we've done, you're encouraging their worst behavior, not their best behavior, inside the conflict zones that we've been talking about, inside Lebanon, inside Iraq, inside Yemen, inside Syria. You're encouraging the worst behavior, not the best. Now, if we encourage them, would they improve? Would they somehow turn from contributing to the conflict to helping mitigate the conflict? Probably not. But we haven't tested that proposition, frankly, since we walked out of the Iran nuclear deal. So I think you need two levels. You need some kind of resilience, something you and I wrote about, Stephen, a resilience framework, prosperity and resilience framework in the region, something that's unlikely to come about as a result only of the major regional actors. It needs to come about through them, but also encouraged by the international actors. And frankly, the US has played a spoiler role in terms of that. So you're going to need a change in November, and you're going to need a change in policy after November, regardless of who wins the election.
Let me take a moment here to encourage everyone in the audience. If you have questions for any of our panelists, please use the Q&A function here at the bottom of your screen. In the meantime, Nancy, let me ask you to react to what Ross was just talking about and ask a similar question, since your research is looking at monitoring these dynamics on an ongoing basis. What would you, not what you expect to see, but what would you have to see to be encouraged that there might be some movement by some of the regional actors or international actors to intervene here in a positive sense rather than in the sense that that we have seen them do in the past?
Well, I fully agree with Ross. To start with, is that we need to move towards a more collaborative approach, and there's opportunity to do that. I see some evidence signals that even a number of regional actors want to move in that direction, such as Iran or Saudi Arabia, but they require, first of all, there's a with the drop in oil prices, the Gulf is facing a financial crunch, and so there's limited resources for it to try and seek such a strategy. But I also think that the increased sort of US maximum pressure strategy on some of the regional actors has only worsened the tensions in the region, making it more difficult to move towards a collaborative approach. From some of the points that were brought up today in the conversation, I think the key issue is to strengthen state capacities to respond to the crisis, to the pandemic, or to the different crises that are overlapping in an efficient but also in an inclusive manner. So leave no one behind. And this includes countries, support to countries like Iran, but also Syria, but also Palestine. And I think without that, we can only continue moving in the direction that the pessimistic direction that we've all presented today, which is more polarization and more fragmentation and more space for sort of chaos and for illicit conflict sort of activities. So I think there is a need for the international community, but also the big players or the big regional players to invest in state capacities to respond to the pandemic. I mean, some of the things that we suggested in our earlier work, which could still hold today, is trying to, for example, support or provide post-COVID recovery assistance in the terms of humanitarian sort of relief efforts that, for example, the EU could provide to Iran in the form of the EU Instex, and the US could give a green light to. This could sort of allow for an economic recovery, but also strengthening the healthcare sector, and could be a way to sort of avoid US sanctions. I think for a regional Marshall Plan, I think also some Gulf countries would require a bit more direction, but a bit more support from US and other international actors to move in that direction, to step up in the region. And I think we've seen a few examples of that, which Ross already mentioned, like UAE support to Iran in its attempt to work with the Assad regime, which indicates sort of an appetite to move in that direction, but that requires more international support to strengthen that position.
That makes a lot of sense. We have a question from the audience, and I'll ask it to any of you who'd like to respond. It's kind of easy and quick to look to the role of the US and the role of Russia in terms of international actors. How do we potentially see a greater involvement in terms of dialogue and commitment and even funding from Europe rather than the US to address and help mitigate some of the factors that all of you are talking about? If any of you, feel free to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a really important question because, you know, Europe certainly has, Europe as a whole and particular countries have a vested interest in what happens in the Middle East. You know, I used to say that what starts in the global community ends up in the Middle East. You know, United States and the Soviet Union competing. We had an Arab Cold War go on, you know, for in the 50s and the 1960s. Prior to that, you had the British and the French kind of imposing their will on the Middle East. But today, I think it's reversed, and that is what starts in the Middle East doesn't stay there. You know, it moves to Europe, it moves to the United States in terms of refugee flows, in terms of economic aftershocks, in terms of potential specter of terrorism. So I think Europe certainly has a vested interest in that. Whether they have the leadership capacity, particularly in the middle of their own crisis, is a wild card. I would say probably not. One of the interesting players, in fact, my colleague at MEI, Alex Patanka, and I wrote a piece, I believe it was last month, about the role of China. You know, China is using particularly the fact that the United States has launched a trade war against China, and also the maximum pressure campaign that Nancy mentioned against Iran. They're using that as a wedge to some degree to move closer to Iran and to insinuate themselves on the security and on the economic front into the Middle East, use the vacuum to create some advantages. Whether that will translate into the kind of role that the questioner asked about playing, that you asked about Europe, playing a more positive role in terms of recovery, in terms of leadership for a resilience, you know, framework or architecture, is probably unlikely. I don't think they have the diplomatic capacity right now to do that, but they are a player that could. But I'm a little bit more pessimistic on the European front. But I would like my colleagues that are actually sitting in the EU right now to comment, because I'm sitting here.
Ali, Nancy, any response to Ross?
Yeah, I can jump in. I completely agree with Ross. I mean, I think pre-pandemic, you're already seeing a huge amount of EU funding go towards the Middle East for sort of economic relief efforts. I think what we're sort of seeing is that organizations right now are being stretched thin in terms of healthcare provision and being able to access certain areas. And obviously people who are already extremely vulnerable are being hardest hit by the pandemic as well. But I think just in terms of European support, I'm not sure what I'm seeing, especially because, you know, in countries that we're working in, is that donors, we work with largely the German government, and they're providing COVID specific relief packages to a lot of NGOs working on the ground in areas where they're seeing that could have a huge impact going forward. So investments in education, economic empowerment to try and mitigate some of the longer term impacts of COVID. For us, I think that there are some positive that will come out of the pandemic. I think globally, we've seen that remote work is possible, and workforces are going to be more distributed. And so I'm hopeful that that will also have a positive long-term influence on the region. So more youth across the region being able to take advantage of employment in other countries, even when their own economies may be collapsing. But obviously that requires us to really work on sort of bridging the digital inequality divide, which is still very real in a lot of the countries across the Middle East. So making sure that there is stronger connectivity and hardware for people to be able to take advantage of online work. And at the lower end, that merely means, you know, potentially having a mobile device and being able to work off your mobile device for companies in the US, for Europe. And I think that that could be a really powerful way to sort of mitigate some of the impacts of this crisis. And I think that requires a lot of engagement from the private sector, people being willing to hire skilled talent from the Middle East to be able to take advantage of, you know, skills gaps that they may be having, especially in sectors that are growing a lot during the pandemic, which is largely technology. So seeing how can we take advantage of the fact that everybody will be more distributed, will be more open to remote work going forward, and how can we take advantage of that moment to actually equalize opportunity across the world as well.
I think that's an important point to, you know, look at some of the things that are changing as a result of the pandemic and how they could, because they are you know, likely to have enduring impacts, could be kind of reframed as part of solutions to some of the problems that we're talking about.
You know, Stephen, just to play off of what Ali said, is that we have seen some flurries of leadership coming from the EU. You know, Macron, President Macron of France, went to Lebanon shortly after the blast that turned Beirut basically into a crater, to try to get some of the stakeholders to move towards some of these reform measures that both Ali and Nancy referred to. But unfortunately, I think without the US leadership, without a broader approach to COVID, but also some of the other structural problems that we have talked about, without a broader support system from other actors within the EU, but also then the United States and Russia, you're unlikely to see that materialize in any kind of have any kind of lasting impact as we approach 2025.
Well, or maybe if I just follow up with a brief thought, I think I agree with both perspectives. I think that the EU as a bloc finds it more difficult to build a unified foreign policy strategy, and that's the issue here, is where we see there's a lot of efforts, individual effort from the Germans, from the French, to pursue a number of foreign policy priorities in some of the Middle Eastern countries, but without sort of concentrated effort across the EU to build sort of more strategic diplomatic ties and relationships with these countries in the Middle East. There's little chances to produce actionable impact. I mean, this far the EU has focused, or the EU as a bloc has focused on stabilization efforts in the Middle East, but has not pursued other longer term sort of diplomatic or strategic interests in the region. And in general, it has tried to follow the US's lead on a number of issues, which also sort of backfired against it. But that doesn't mean there's no opportunity there. There is a lot of opportunity, and there are today within the EU, but within sort of a number of the larger European countries, a lot of pressure to pursue a more sustainable and strategic Middle East foreign policy. So, I mean, I think especially today, and depends on what comes out of the US elections and what the US's foreign policy in the region turns out in the next few years. But I think the EU's role in the region does or could come back as a key discussion or a key component of foreign policy.
We have another question from the audience, and it touches on the sanctions that have been levied against Iran. And it reminds me of something that Ross and I wrote about in our paper. It's easy and sort of we all are drawn to the idea of what are the actions that could be taken? What can we do? What can governments do? It's less intuitive, but sometimes just as important to think about what are the things to stop doing or to not do that are already ongoing that could make a difference. We referred to it in our piece as a kind of a Hippocratic foreign policy, right? Do no harm, stop doing the harm that we're doing. So sanctions being one example, let me ask each of you in turn, what can you identify that is being done by governments in the region, by international powers that maybe could be dialed back and in this time of crisis by stopping doing something we're doing, create the conditions for some improvement with respect to how the pandemic is impacting the societies at all, and particularly how it's impacting conflict. Ross, can I start with you?
Sure. Sanctions are easier to impose than to dial back, both in terms of the effects that the sanctions have had and also in terms of the sanctions themselves. So one of the things that we could do, I believe, needs to be done, is to reverse the policy of the Trump administration vis-a-vis Iran. Now, the bet on the future that the Obama administration had made was just that. It was a bet on the future. It wasn't a bet on the current moment, on the immediate moment. It was a bet that over time, by taking the nuclear issue off the table, that for a period of time anyway, that other kind of progress could be made on regional cooperation, on issues creating resiliency, like for the COVID crisis we're dealing with right now. And that bet really was only a couple years old before it was dialed back. So I think one of the things that could happen is that we're likely, if we see an Obama administration, a Biden administration, sorry, maybe Freudian slip there, if we saw a Biden administration, that we might see a change in policy. The wild card is not just on the US side of who wins the election in November, it's also what happens in Iran. Because what has happened in terms of the maximum pressure campaign is it has reinforced the hardline position in Iran. And I know when I and other MEI senior officials met with Javad Zarif, the foreign minister, last April, we saw a dramatic shift in his attitude, much more closer to the hardline position that we see among the Revolutionary Guard than we would have expected from Javad Zarif or President Rouhani. So you've seen a hardening already in terms of negotiating with the United States, in terms of their policy. They're actually starting to break out of the nuclear deal. They haven't completely breached the deal, but they're edging, towards higher levels of enrichment. So that's number one. Number two, Iran's going to go through an election next year. So what the outcome of that election is can also determine. I think the best the U.S. can do is to basically reverse course, frankly, with respect to Iran, and try to push the other regional actors into more constructive mode. Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, try to resolve the conflict that they have with Qatar, and then try to build bridges back towards where we were before 2015 or in 2015 in terms of a better, more active diplomacy and a diplomatic track towards Iran?
Nancy?
Well, I think if you also think of it in light of what how we started out this conversation of weak state capacities to respond to the pandemic, what we see is U.S. support, not only U.S. but international support, but specifically led by the U.S. to governments in the region, be it Iraq or Lebanon or other countries like Iran and Syria at the more extreme end, has been conditional on the success of its allies or appointing its allies in positions of power. And it has not been really conditional on improving state capacities, I think. And that is why what this has produced is, beyond the sanction strategy, this has produced sort of limited state capacities to respond to crises, not just the pandemic, and has allowed space for sub-state actors to proliferate. And that is how these power structures have been fragmented. I think that the US support to some of these countries, but specifically to states within these countries, should begin investing in longer term capacities rather than political deals and political negotiations on power positions. Because what that has produced is it only has produced further fragmentation and more competition, not only for domestic actors, but for the US itself in some of these countries.
Ali, any thoughts on that question?
No, I don't think I have anything additional to add. I think Ross and Nancy covered everything there.
Okay. We have one last question here as we're coming up on our time, and it has to do with Turkey. And before I lose it here, do we see or think that Turkey might strengthen their efforts to exert influence in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and other countries because of the COVID-19 exacerbating some of the other political, social, and economic crises in the region? Any thoughts from any of you on that?
Well, Turkey is involved. Let's see, where are they involved today? They're involved in Syria. They're involved in Iraq. They're involved in Libya. They're involved in the Eastern Mediterranean. They're involved in Nagorno-Karabakh. So I'm not sure in terms of their capacity for leadership at this point in playing a more constructive role. I'm skeptical at this point, but I'm not as close to the ground as maybe Nancy and Ali. Comment on that.
Yeah, I would say that since COVID, the pandemic happened, Turkey has been increasing their attacks on both Iraq and Syria. And I think that they've just been opportunistic about that. So there's been a lot more attacks in sort of the Kurdistan region. I don't know whether that will sort of diminish as the pandemic dies down, but they've certainly taken advantage of this sort of gap and distraction by other governments to increase their levels of attacks there.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one to address. I think that Turkey's trying to sort of expand its regional influence. To what degree you consider its efforts successful is debatable. I mean, in our report earlier in April, what we had hoped is that the pandemic would push Turkey westwards through sort of what we saw as sort of the economic impact of the pandemic could perhaps lead Ankara to reassess its needs for good relations with the EU, but more specifically because the pandemic and the induced border shutdowns have deprived Turkey of its refugee blackmail card for now. So we had hoped that the EU would use this to negotiate a political deal with Turkey. Unfortunately, we don't see the EU trying to pursue any pressure against Turkey, even though it's in a position to. But other than that, I think that also Turkey's efforts to expand influence in the region is not as successful as one would think. For example, in countries like Lebanon, it's a long shot. And other, I see it's as a similar scenario in other places, not only because of its limited resources, but also because it's building enemies wherever it goes.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, I agree absolutely with what Nancy
Please, yes.
and what Ali mentioned. I would like to return us to an earlier question, the question about what should we stop doing. And I think this actually gets at the question of what role Turkey could play. I think that one of the things that we're seeing in the Middle East that you might consider a good sign is that historically the Middle East has been driven heavily, as I mentioned earlier, by outside powers, taking signals from the outside world. And I think what we're seeing today in terms of the conflicts, including the civil wars, is the region is undergoing its own internal transformation. And that internal transformation is bloody, but it's also homegrown in many ways. You know, it's internal dynamics are driving where the Middle East is heading between now and 2025. And I think the international community needs to understand that when we look at actors like Turkey or Iran, we need to understand that we need to be giving the right signals in terms of how they need to come together. And Turkey, Iran, two of the actors that the audience asked about, those are two key pivotal players. We may not like them. We may not like Iranian behavior. We may not like Turkish behavior today. As Nancy mentioned, they've gone from a zero problems with neighbor strategy earlier to a no friends at all in the region. And we need to recognize that there are bad instincts that the regional actors can play and better instincts. And the international community needs to get their act together to the best of their ability, which means the EU, the United States, and ideally would be Russia and China, to play to the best instincts of these actors. We can't force their hand, but we can try to reinforce the best behavior we can and give the right signals. And we're not doing that right now. And that bodes very poorly for how the region is going to recover from COVID, frankly.
Ross, I think that's a really important perspective on this that we all need to keep in mind. We're just about out of time. Let me give either Ali or Nancy any opportunity for last thoughts before I wrap us up.
I'm trying to think of something positive, optimistic. Sorry, I'm trying to think of something optimistic to end with, but I'm struggling. But I think that it has to get worse before it gets better. And I think I like that we're ending on Ross's point that says that we need to give these countries more agency. We can nudge them in the right direction, but we need to allow for domestic agency and political agency to just mature on its own terms. Despite the pessimistic scenarios that we've all presented or we're all witnessing today, I think that there are a few good or positive indicators that we could take from some countries in the region. Iraq has not been doing fairly well, but its democratic processes are still in place, and that's something we could take as a nudge in the right direction. We just hope for more change, for more positive change.
Well, I think that in a way, I think that ties us back to one of the ideas earlier that Ross raised about countries all around the world, honestly, are going to be focusing inwardly in the near future of necessity. And so maybe that ties back to this idea. It may be beyond the capacity of many countries to invest, to intervene, to do something, but maybe while they're turning inwardly, to simply encourage and nudge is a positive act in and of itself, perhaps. And it's what we do in the work that we're doing in this program, is try to look forward to some of these, potential future scenarios, if you will, and what it would look like, and then look back from them to what we would have to see in order to get them. And I think we've touched on a lot of examples of that in the course of the hour here today. So Ross and Allie and Nancy, I want to thank all three of you for taking the time to join us today. This has been a terrific discussion. I want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us. And there will be a recording of this webinar available on MEI's website after we're done here today. So with that, I will sign us off, and thank you all again very much.